Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, thank you. It's wonderful to see you here this evening. Before I begin, I'd like to pay a special tribute to a couple who's celebrating their third wedding anniversary by being here at this lecture. Lawrence and Dacia Dietlein. Are you here, Lawrence and Dacia? Let's hear it for them. We wish you many more. Just about a year ago, this institution was honored that the Holy Father chose our president to go to Rome and head up the Secretary for Catholic Education around the world. It was a great honor for Archbishop J. Michael Miller, for our university, and for the city of Houston. In honor of that event, we had a very nice thing happen to us. We had a couple literally walk in from the street, walk into Candida Dominicus's office, and said in his honor, that isn't, not in your honor, in Archbishop Miller's honor, we would like to endow a chair of Catholic Studies. And that was a wonderful gift. That is indeed happening, and that's we're privileged to have Sister here as a result of that generosity. At the same time, the university tried to find ways in which we could take advantage of this great honor and talk about and really explain Catholic studies to the Houston community. And one way we decided to do that was to establish the Archbishop J. Michael Miller series and lectures in which we could bring in outstanding individuals to talk about our faith in terms that everyone could understand. Now, the Catholic Studies itself is doing very well thanks to Sister's good work. We have a lot of students here. And students, if you could just stand up for a minute and let us see. And we had some great ones here. Tiffany, everybody else, let's hear it for them. Thank you, ladies. I'm told you will get special credit tomorrow. So, but this is the inaugural address. And we're so very, very pleased that we have an outstanding individual, Dr. Robert George from Princeton University, to come and give it for us. Sister Paula Jean Miller, the director of the Catholic Studies program, will give the formal induction. I'd just like to say thank you very much for coming and to give a special thanks to our benefactor. Dr. Jim Considine was very gracious to start this series. And Dr. Jim, thank you very much, sir. Let's hear it about Jim. I can't think really of a better way to start the lecture series and to do it in such a way that it reaches a wider audience, and hopefully it'll be the first of many such inaugural series or of such speeches. Thank you so much for doing it. Sister Paula Jean.
The motto of the Catholic Studies program is to link your profession to your faith. And this has been a particular call of Pope John Paul II in his document Christa Fidelis Laici, in which he lays out for us the vocation and mission of the laity, the mission to transform the secular and temporal world, not by standing on the street corners and preaching the gospel, but rather by having professionals who are at the top of their game live the Christian principles within that very professional expertise. And that is the desire of the Catholic Studies program, and particularly this Archbishop Miller lecture series, to bring into you, the greater Houston community, professionals who are at the top of their game and who have done so by integrating the principles of the Catholic intellectual tradition within the way that they practice their profession. The man that we have chosen to launch this Archbishop Miller lecture series is Dr. Robert George. Robert P. George is McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions as well as professor of politics at Princeton University. Professor George is also a member on the Council on Foreign Relations. He serves as of counsel to the law firm of Robinson and McElwee. And in 1994, he represented Mother Teresa of Calcutta as counsel of record for her friend of the court brief, asking the Supreme Court to reverse Roe v. Wade. A graduate of Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School, Professor George earned a doctorate in philosophy of law from Oxford University after having received the Knox Fellowship from Harvard. Dr. George presently serves on the President's Council on Bioethics and was the United States representative to the 20th anniversary of the Comité Consultatif National d'Éthique in Paris in February 2003. From 1993 to 1998, he served as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights, where he took the lead in the Commission's hearings on religious freedom in America's public schools. He is also a former judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the 1990 Justice Tom C. Clark Award. He is the recipient of the Silver Gavel Award of the American Bar Association, the Paul Bader Award of the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy, and several honorary doctorates. In addition to the many books and articles he has published, which will be available for you in the foyer, Professor George is general editor of New Forum Books, a series on law, culture, and politics published by Princeton University Press. He is a member of the editorial board of the American Journal of Jurisprudence, the editorial advisory board of First Things, and the board of consulting editors of Academic Questions. If you think he hasn't done enough yet, I could give you his 20-page resume. I only took the top pickings. Needless to say, Dr. Robert George is eminently qualified to inaugurate the Archbishop Miller Lecture Series with his reflections on public morality. This is an issue which we believe is critical to all conscientious citizens in this and every era, and we welcome his insights into both the obligations of government and our own responsibility as citizens, committed to living the principles of Christianity within the public forum. We are most pleased and honored to present to you tonight Dr. Robert P. George.
Thank you very, very much, Sister Paula Jean, for that immensely warm and flattering introduction. And I want to thank you, Sister, for the invitation. I'm deeply honored to be the inaugural lecturer for the Archbishop J. Michael Miller Lecture Series. As someone said at dinner this evening in another connection, from here there's no way but up. President Ivani, let me thank you as well for this opportunity, and let me congratulate you on your inauguration here. You've inherited the helm of a wonderful institution with an exemplary program in Catholic studies, exemplary in the technical sense. I hope it will be an example to programs in Catholic institutions, and not just Catholic institutions around the country. I congratulate you for this program in Catholic studies, and long may it flourish. Let me say a word of thanks to the anniversary couple. I can't tell you how touched I am that you would be here to listen to my lecture this evening when you could be spending a romantic evening at home listening to President Bush's State of the Union address. And Dr. Considine, where's Dr. Doctor? Let me thank you especially, Doctor, for this honor and for endowing this lecture series. I hope I don't let you down. We in the academic world are deeply indebted, of course, to our donors. They make everything possible for us. There are some institutions that have state legislatures that do it. This isn't one. My home institution of Princeton University isn't one. We don't give our donors enough credit. None of it would be possible without them. And of course, once you're a donor, people are after you all the time, constantly trying to pick your pocket. But I want Mr. Considine to know that sometimes it works out to your advantage. They tell the story at Princeton of a young fellow who graduated from Princeton, loved the place, like so many Princeton alums, ferociously loyal. I'm sure it's true here as well, just ferociously loyal. Well, this young fellow, as many young Princeton fellows have done, went off and made himself a fortune in no time flat. Got very rich, got married, lovely girl, and after a couple of years, they decided they would go on an anniversary trip on his yacht. So they took out the yacht, the weather was beautiful, but then, of course, things suddenly turned. A storm came up, terrible thing. The tiny ship was tossed. And the next thing you know, they're stranded, washed up on a desert island. Well, of course, the wife was absolutely beside herself with terror. We're in the middle of nowhere, out in the ocean, island probably never charted. No one will know where we are. What's to become of us? And the husband, he sat and he thought for a moment. He thought, and then he turned to his wife and said, "Honey, nothing to worry about. Everything's going to be okay." And she said, "Well, what makes you think that?" He said, "Well, I was just trying to remember whether I sent in that check for the annual contribution to Princeton, and I haven't. They'll find us." And they would, let me tell you, they would. Well, this evening I'm speaking on the subject of public morality, and particularly on the question of the role of citizens and the obligations of government in this area. And I want to stress that we have obligations and responsibilities really on both sides of this equation. Public morality, like public health and public safety, is a concern, that is to say, that goes beyond considerations of law and public policy. There really are citizen obligations. Public morals are affected for good or for ill by the activities of private, that is, non-governmental parties, and such parties therefore have obligations in respect to it. The acts of private parties, indeed sometimes even the apparently private acts of private parties, can and do have public consequences. And choices to do things that one knows will bring about bad consequences, whether directly or indirectly, are governed by moral norms, including, above all, norms of justice. Such norms will often constitute conclusive reasons for private parties not to bring about harmful public consequences. And again, whether those consequences are in the area of safety, of health, or of morals. Now, let's just for a second here at the beginning lay aside the issue of public morality and focus on matters of public health and safety. Even apart from laws prohibiting the creation of fire hazards, for example, individuals have an obligation to avoid placing persons and property in jeopardy of fire. Similarly, even apart from legal liability in tort for unreasonably subjecting people to toxic pollutants, companies are under an obligation in justice to avoid freely spewing forth, say, carcinogenic smoke from their facilities. Concerns for public health and safety are, to be sure, justificatory grounds of criminal and civil laws. It's perfectly just to restrict, for the sake of public health and safety, where fires can be lit. It's perfectly just to use the legislative power, for the sake of health and safety, to limit the spewing of carcinogenic smoke or other pollutants into the air. Perfectly just. But these same concerns also ground moral obligations that obtain even apart from laws and even in their absence. The absence of a law doesn't leave a moral vacuum as to whether it's acceptable for me to place my fellow citizens in jeopardy of fire, or for me as a factory owner to spew carcinogenic pollutants into the air in order to reduce my costs. Now, what is true of public health and public safety is equally true, I want to argue, of public morals. That's much neglected and, truth be told, much maligned doctrine. Take as an example the problem of pornography. Material designed to appeal to the prurient interest in sex by arousing carnal desire unintegrated with the procreative and unitive goods of marriage, where such material flourishes, damages a community's moral ecology in ways that really are quite directly analogous to those in which carcinogenic smoke spewing forth from a factory's smokestacks damages the community's physical ecology. The central harm of pornography is not, as some people seem to suppose, that it shocks and offends other people, any more than the central harm of carcinogenic smoke is that it smells bad. Rather, the central harm of pornography is moral harm, harm to character, and thus to the human goods and institutions, above all the good and institution of marriage, that are preserved and advanced by the disposition to act uprightly, and damaged and defiled by a contrary disposition in respect to them. So the analogy is with the harmful impact of carcinogenic pollutants on the physical health of people subjected to them. And just as companies have obligations in justice quite apart from considerations of legal liability to avoid damaging people's health by polluting the air, so too people have an obligation in justice, even apart from legal prohibitions, to avoid harming people's character and the goods and institutions that depend on widespread good character by disseminating and making available to them pornographic materials. We in our own culture in 2005 can illustrate this quite easily, because the fact of the matter is that rulings by the Supreme Court of the United States, as interpretations of the First Amendment of the Constitution, to my mind very poor interpretations, utterly implausible, truth be told, interpretations, but nevertheless the prevailing interpretations give extraordinarily wide room to pornographers to create and disseminate their material. It's almost impossible for prosecutors outside of the child pornography area, and even there it's tough, to crack down on pornography. That's why it's so freely available even in otherwise respectable shops. You can't walk through an airport, as I did today, and look for a copy of the Wall Street Journal without seeing what you see on the shelves. Does that mean, because it's legal, that no injustice is done by people who apply this stuff? Well, not at all, because there are moral norms that apply that constrain our freedom of maneuver, even apart from legal norms, even where there are no legal impediments to the dissemination of pornography in place. Now, of course, an objection will immediately be raised. Pornography, it will be said, is quite unlike toxic environmental pollutants, even if it's true that pornography is morally bad in the way I have asserted. The difference, it will be said, is that members of a community cannot avoid breathing carcinogens that are spewed forth by a factory's smokestacks except by leaving town. But people can avoid morally harmful effects of pornography simply by declining to purchase and look at it. You've all heard the argument. People say, well, look, if you're against that stuff, don't have it on your TV. Turn it off. Don't buy it. No one's forcing you to. So the argument goes, environmental polluters really do an injustice in spewing carcinogenic and other toxic pollutants into the air, but pornographers do no injustice to those who, after all, freely choose to subject themselves to their offerings. Now, this counterargument is ordinarily raised in connection with the question whether laws against pornography are justified. But notice that I'm considering it here simply on its own merits, and for the moment quite apart from questions of legal regulation. The question I have in front of us now is not whether there should be laws. The question is, even apart from laws, assume there is no legal restriction on pornography, do people have moral reasons, reasons of justice, not to be involved in the pornography dissemination business? Well, I don't think this counter-argument works, and let me say why. First of all, it can be and often is unjust to people to subject them to powerful temptations to do things that are harmful to them, morally or otherwise, and whether or not they are cognizant of the harm. If we step away from the question of moral harm, that becomes, I think, quite clear. Secondly, and even more importantly, the accumulation of private decisions to use pornography, just to stick with the pornography example, the accumulation of private decisions as it impacts those who choose to use it affects, sometimes profoundly, the community as a whole. For example, where pornography flourishes, as it does in our own culture, it erodes important shared public understandings of sexuality and sexual morality on which the health of the institutions of marriage and the family in any culture vitally depend. It weakens the resolve of men to be good husbands. It damages the ability to raise boys who are respectful of women and to raise girls who understand that boys ought to be respectful of women. This is a classic case in which the accumulation of apparently private choices by private individuals has big public consequences. The culture is different because of an accumulation of what considered just individually are just private choices. The culture is not only different, it's worse particularly in respect of our ability to rear children to be healthy adults, respectful of each other, upright. So the pornographer, though a private party, fails in respect of his duties in justice to public morality, just as the environmental polluter, ordinarily motivated by the same consideration, that is money, fails in respect of his duties in justice to public health. And pornographers are not alone among the private parties whose unjust actions damage public morality. People who write and pose for pornographic publications and films, people who distribute pornography and make it available in newsstands, bookstores, theaters, and video shops, and notably, people who purchase pornography, thus sustaining the industries that produce and disseminate it, and even those who, in non-commercial contexts, circulate it to friends, fellow workers, and so forth. Well, there is much to be said and much more to be said about pornography and public morality, and I'll say a little bit more about it later in relation to a particular species of argument against public morals legislation. But I introduce it here only for the purpose of illustrating the first point I want to make, namely, that public morality is not simply an issue about what laws we should have. It's not just about what the laws should be. Too often that's what people think when they think public morality. That's a question about laws. Well, it is a question about laws, but it's not just a question about laws, and we mustn't forget that. Nor is it a concern that has no bearing on the moral deliberations and obligations of private parties as opposed to public officials. The common good of public morality, that is the good of a healthy moral ecology, generates obligations in justice for all of us, just as do the common goods of public health and public safety. Again, I use the example of pornography as just that, as an example. Not because it's the worst evil. It's bad. It's not the worst evil. Certainly not the only evil. This is not to suggest that there aren't lots of other terrible things that go on that are matters of public morality, including the failures of business ethics of the sort that we've seen in the great corporate scandals and so forth. But I'm just using it as an example that we all know about, that we can, I think, speak a common language concerning and try to understand how it gives rise to citizen obligations in precisely the same way that citizens have obligations in respect of public health and safety. Now let me make a second point, namely that law and government play a role, albeit a secondary or subsidiary role, in upholding public morality. Here's the other half of the equation. Citizens do have obligations to public morality, just as they have obligations to public health and public safety. But so does the government, and the government's obligation is a secondary or subsidiary one. It's not the government that has the primary responsibility of upholding public morality. But because it doesn't have the primary one, doesn't mean that it has no obligation. Rather, it means that it has a secondary or subsidiary obligation. The primary role, I want to submit to you, is played by families, churches, organizations such as the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the Campfire Girls, other institutions that work closely with individuals, and by working closely with individuals, inculcate an understanding of morality and promote virtue. The grandfather of Thomistic studies, you have such a wonderful, great tradition of Thomistic studies at this university. The grandfather, perhaps we should say the great-grandfather of Thomistic studies, was this Greek fellow, Aristotle. And Aristotle was right on the mark when he noticed all the way back in pre-Christian times that law could not work on the individual the way the family could work on the individual. The family works with the individual directly. Law has to handle things in gross terms, at the broader scale. So how does a person become virtuous? Well, the law's role can only be secondary because it doesn't know Tommy or Jill. Around here, I guess I should say Tiffany. I've met some Tiffanys here. But mom and dad do know Tommy or Jill or Tiffany. So the primary responsibility is with mom and dad and with the parish priest or the minister or the rabbi, the religious community, the scouts, the organizations that work with people and know their names. The great thing about the law is it doesn't know anybody's name. The law applies without proper names. No special rules for anybody, at least if it's well-functioning, proper, good, just law. No proper names. But parents know proper names. So the primary obligation, the primary role, and the state mustn't forget it because the state must never displace the parental role, primary role is with the institutions of civil society. The government's role is secondary. Despite the fact that public morality is a public good, its maintenance depends far more on contributions of private institutions than on those of law and government. Where families, churches, and other so-called institutions of civil society fail, or where they are unable to play their parts, laws will hardly suffice to uphold public morality. Friends, if we have to rely on the law alone, we're sunk. Law's role can only be secondary, supporting those who have the primary role. Ordinarily, at least, law's role is to support families, churches, and the like. And of course, law goes wrong when it displaces those institutions and usurps their authority. At the same time, the role of law in upholding public morality is undermined, can be undermined by churches, families, and other institutions who abdicate their responsibilities, or still worse, who promote false and morally destructive practices. Just to take the example of parents, of which I am one, we can go wrong not only by abdicating our responsibilities to our children, but by also teaching them the wrong things. Well, okay, consider the current turmoil over marriage, perhaps the hottest of the social issues of our time. Well, not of our time, that's got to be the pro-life issue, but of the moment, the turmoil over marriage. If, as I believe, the good of marriage and its institutional integrity in our society depend on a firm understanding of and public commitment to marriage as a sexual union of one man and one woman, then a threat to marriage can come either from bad public policy or from the misguided actions of key non-governmental associations, or it can come from both. On the one hand, law and public policy, in the name of a false neutrality, could undermine marriage by authorizing as marriages or their equivalent intrinsically non-marital, for example, same-sex or polygamous sexual relationships. In so doing, law and public policy would make it immeasurably more difficult for families, churches, and other institutions of civil society to fulfill their primary role in upholding public morals in respect of marriage. On the other hand, even where the law maintains a sound doctrine of marriage, the institutional integrity of marriage could be gravely damaged by, for example, churches that, in the name of whatever moral or theological principle, bless same-sex or polygamous unions, or by companies that treat employees' non-marital sexual partners as spouses. Now, of course, the validity of what I'm saying about marriage entirely depends on whether I am right about its true nature. However, my point about public morality, which I'm using marriage here simply again to illustrate, my point about public morality holds even if I'm wrong about marriage. Suppose I am wrong. Suppose that the true understanding of marriage extends to a range of possibilities, including same-sex and polygamous relationships, and that it is mere bigotry on my part that stands in the way of my perceiving this truth. In that case, public morals regarding marriage can be damaged either by laws unreasonably restricting marriage, as did anti-miscegenation laws, laws against racial intermarriage, that both reflected and reinforced racism in certain parts of the United States in an earlier day. Or damage to public morality could be done by churches, such as the Catholic Church, whose theologies and disciplines pertaining to marriage embody and promote what, if I'm wrong about marriage, would count as bigotry. Public morality would be damaged. Well, that is the sum and substance of what I have to say here about the obligations in justice of private parties to avoid damaging public morality, and the primary role and responsibility of non-governmental institutions in inculcating virtue and thus upholding public morals. I hope that what I've said helps to elucidate the concept of public morality by detaching it from the question of law's part in protecting it. Now, however, I want to turn to that much debated question. Now, as traditionally conceived, the so-called police powers of governments of general jurisdiction extend to the protection and advancement of public health, safety, and morals. Particularly in the American setting, where as a constitutional matter, power is shared between the federal government and the states, the federal government considered as a government of strictly delegated and enumerated powers, the states being governments of general jurisdiction, it's important to bear in mind the difference between these two levels and types of government. Governments like the states, governments of general jurisdiction, exercise police powers, including the police power to protect and promote public morals. Governments that are governments of enumerated powers, like our federal government, do not do that, except to the extent that such governments are constitutionally empowered to act in certain domains to combat particular threats to the public interest. Well, what is meant by governments of general jurisdiction? When we refer to the state governments as governments of general jurisdiction and distinguish them from the national government as a government of enumerated powers, what does that mean? Well, governments of general jurisdiction are constitutionally empowered to act by way of legislation, regulation, and so forth to preserve and advance the common good of the polities they serve, subject only to limitations constitutionally imposed on the scope of their power. In other words, if the Constitution doesn't take away a power, the states have got it. In the United States, the governments of the states are, in form at least, governments of general jurisdiction. They've got unlimited powers, except where those powers are limited by constitutional provisions. Provisions in the form of rights, such as the First Amendment to the Constitution, provisions that may be expressed without any reference to rights, which simply tell the states that they can't do certain things like grant titles of nobility. They exercise police powers legally subject only to state or federal constitutional limitations on their authority. So, for example, in Massachusetts and other states whose constitutions include so-called Blaine amendments, state governments are disempowered from using public funds to support religiously affiliated primary and secondary schools. In addition to such state constitutional limits on the powers of state governments, the Constitution of the United States imposes certain limits. For example, Article 1, Section 10 forbids states from entering into treaties, from granting letters of marque and reprisal. We had almost forgotten what letters of marque and reprisal were. Maybe some people still, this doesn't ring a bell. They've suddenly come back to life. They're governmental grants to private authorities, or private individuals, private persons, of the power to wage war. So when the question of an invasion of Afghanistan arose, a congressman from Texas, as a matter of fact, Congressman Paul from Texas, introduced in Congress a bill that would create letters of marque to empower certain private tribesmen in Afghanistan to pay them to wage war on behalf of the United States. Well, states can't do that. The federal government reserves that power under the Constitution. States have it taken away. If it weren't taken away by the Constitution, they'd have it. Same with coining money. States can't do that. Granting titles of nobility, passing bills of attainder, ex post facto laws, laws impairing the obligation of contracts. Now, in addition to these express limitations, the Supreme Court of the United States claims to have discovered in the federal Constitution implied limitations of the police powers of states that forbid them from, for example, prohibiting or significantly restricting abortion. That's Roe versus Wade. Limiting what a candidate can spend from his own resources on a political campaign, and making it an offense, this was a Texas law, to desecrate the American flag. Now, whatever one thinks of the validity of these rulings, it's plain that in the absence of express or implied constitutional limitation, the state of Texas or any other state as a government of general jurisdiction would be legally permitted to support religious schools, release people from contractual obligation, grant titles of nobility, limit campaign spending, grant letters of marque and reprisal, restrict abortion, prohibit flag desecration, and so forth. Now, in this respect, the governments of the states differ markedly, again in form at least, from the government of the United States. The latter government is not a government of general jurisdiction. It's not constitutionally authorized to exercise police powers. On the contrary, it is a government of delegated and enumerated powers, where the states are generally authorized to act for the sake of the common good, enjoying the authority to act except to the extent that their jurisdiction is constitutionally limited. The federal government, by contrast, may, as a constitutional matter, act only where it has been constitutionally authorized to act, delegated the power to act. And again, this can be express or implied. Now, I'll give you an example. Since the Constitution originally contained no authorization of federal income taxation without apportionment among the several states, proponents of the income tax found it necessary to amend the Constitution, as they succeeded in doing in 1913, to confer this taxing power on the national government. However desirable its proponents judged the income tax to be as a matter of public policy, as a means of preserving or enhancing the welfare of the nation, they could not simply put a bill through Congress to enact an income tax. It was necessary for them first to bring into being by amendment a constitutional delegation of the power to impose the tax. Likewise, the prohibition of intoxicating liquors. Prior to the ratification of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919, the federal government, lacking the police power, had no authority to regulate or prohibit the sale of alcoholic beverages. 1 year after ratification, according to the terms of the amendment, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the United States, or the importation thereof, or the exportation therefrom of the United States was constitutionally prohibited. And Congress was given concurrent authority to legislate to enforce this constitutional prohibition. And there the matter rested until a thirsty America effected repeal of the 18th Amendment by the 21st in 1933. Repeal, in turn, returned the matter to state regulation. Well, of course, the century just concluded witnessed a massive expansion of the power of the national government, largely at the expense of the states. Formal constitutional amendment, as with the income tax, is one way this happened. More often, however, the courts, after some initial resistance in the New Deal era, and the American people as a whole simply acquiesced in the federal government's claim to be exercising implied delegated powers, as, for example, with the Social Security and federal welfare systems. Now, in the new century, the delegated powers doctrine is a limitation on the jurisdiction of the national government, whether in respect of health, safety, or morals, seems as false in practice as it is true in theory. For in all practical purposes, the government of the United States has come to function as a government of general jurisdiction, more or less freely exercising what can only be termed police powers. Of course, the formalities associated with the delegated powers doctrine continue to be observed. Whenever and for whatever reason Congress acts, it always purports to do so under some power granted to it by the Constitution, ordinarily the power to regulate interstate commerce. True, the Supreme Court has found an occasion or two in the last decade to invalidate acts of Congress as overstepping the delegated powers of the national government. By and large, however, the federal government acts as a government of general jurisdiction, constrained only by those limitations expressly or impliedly set forth in the Constitution of the United States, such as provisions forbidding the government from establishing religious tests for public office, or prohibiting the free exercise of religion, or abridging the freedom of speech, conducting unreasonable searches and seizures, or imposing excessive fines. The federal government's effective exercise of police powers is evident in a variety of areas of health and safety, federal environmental laws, for example, occupational safety and health regulations. All these laws preempt state legislation across a vast swath of terrain and, for better or worse, affect us every day. You're right now sitting in a room that is regulated by federal law. The classic instance in the public morals area was the Mann Act, prohibiting the transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes, that is, prostitution. Similarly, Congress has prohibited the use of the males for the distribution of obscene materials, including child pornography, and Congress is attempting, at least albeit so far unsuccessfully, in the face of judicial resistance, to restrict children's access to indecent material on the internet, and there are some other examples. Well, whether it is the federal or state governments exercising the police power to protect public morals, what is the nature of the power? As an abstract matter of political morality, what is its justification? Consideration of the specifics of contemporary American constitutional interpretation aside, what is the scope of the power to protect public morals, and what are its limits? Well, what is public morality? One way of understanding it is simply morality, the moral uprightness of individual people and the associations they form, considered insofar as it is a public good. But morality of what sort? Political morality, that is, the principles and norms of right and wrong as they pertain to the establishment of a system of government and to that government's actions, is in a rather obvious sense a public good. It's for the public good that there be a just government. But political morality is not what government upholds. It is not the public good for whose sake a government of general jurisdiction acts when government successfully exercises its police power to protect public morality. Public morals legislation does not regulate the government or governmental actors as such. It's not directed at them. Rather, it regulates the behavior of individuals, citizens, and those residing permanently or temporarily within the government's jurisdiction. It limits their choices and behaviors. It regulates their conduct. But insofar as these are private, that is to say non-governmental actors, in what sense do these regulations protect a public good? Now, I've already said a bit about why I think they do protect a public good when I talked about the example of pornography. As we have seen, public morals laws, like health and safety regulations, regulate private conduct insofar as it harms or threatens to harm a public interest, like the public interest in maintaining a healthy moral ecology in respect of marriage, one in which children can be reared to respect each other and to live by the types of norms that have to be observed if marriage as an institution is to flourish and not collapse. Now, here it's important to avoid confusion. Sometimes the term private, when used to describe or classify conduct, is meant to indicate precisely conduct that does not bear on the public interest, or which is not legitimately subject to government prohibition or restriction, even if it does affect the public interest. The term thus figures in accounts of or arguments about political morality. Typically, it's invoked as part of a claim about the alleged injustice of certain acts of government that, say, violate a fundamental right of the individual against a certain form of regulation, which might very well be morals laws. Such laws, it is commonly asserted, violate citizens' constitutional liberty or right to privacy, as in American Supreme Court jurisprudence, or right to moral independence, or what have you. Now, obviously, that's not here how I'm using the term. Rather, I'm using it to refer to conduct by individuals or groups acting as private parties, as opposed to those who are exercising the power of the state. Now, this is not to suggest that the actions of government cannot harm public morality. I've already said that they could. Nothing could be further from the truth than to think otherwise. And I have in mind here not merely the failure of government prudently to act where it can act to protect public morality against the damaging consequences of private immoral actions. That's certainly one thing. Another thing, however, is government action that itself positively undermines public morals by, for example, encouraging and facilitating immoral conduct by private citizens. If prostitution, for example, is, as I believe it to be, a wicked practice, then local governments in the Netherlands undermine public morality by, assuming that the newspapers are telling the truth here, by providing free prostitutes to physically disabled, though evidently not too physically disabled, men, and I have no doubt women who request them. But of course, no government is going to legislate against its own bad moral judgments. However bizarre the Dutch policy is, it would be even more peculiar to find the Dutch government enacting morals legislation to prohibit the Dutch government from providing prostitutes, though there wouldn't be anything at all odd about the people of the Netherlands were they so inclined constitutionally to prohibit their government from getting up to such shenanigans. If the Dutch government saw the thing rightly from the moral point of view, there would be no need for legislation. It would simply discontinue the policy of providing prostitutes. Now, this is not simply an issue for people over across the water. Think of the gambling case here. Some people think that gambling is in principle immoral. Most Catholics don't think that. But most Catholics do think that gambling is a dangerous thing, can be a dangerous thing, at least for certain people. Can lead to immorality where people fail to care for their own families, gamble away resources that are really necessary for the maintenance of their families, the education of their children, putting food on the table. And that raises the question, when government implicates itself in gambling, when it promotes gambling, when it facilitates gambling, when it profits from gambling, is it undermining public morality? I think that's a question that has to be taken seriously by citizens, even if they are not people who think that gambling is in principle wrong the way prostitution is in principle wrong. If it can be a cause of serious individual immorality, is the public promotion of it itself a morally dubious thing? I think a very good argument can be made that it is. But to stay with the example of prostitution, a classic subject of morals laws, let's think further about what public good is damaged, what public harm is done by the provision of prostitutes, whether by the government in the grip of sexual liberationist ideology or by private businessmen just motivated by greed. Well, assuming again that prostitution is indeed immoral, and of course plenty of people today don't think it is, but assuming that it is, then the availability of prostitutes is going to facilitate immoral acts by individuals, that is, by prostitutes and their customers. Of course, the commercial sex acts will likely take place in private, that is, behind closed doors. And it could be the case that there is no highly visible publicizing of the prostitute's availability, although unless there's some way of getting the word out publicly, there won't be much work for the prostitutes, will there? Still, public interests are damaged, I want to submit. So we need to not be confused here by the idea that, well, gee, since it happens in private, it must be a private matter in which no public harm is done, no public interests are implicated. Nothing could be further from the truth. The public has an interest in men not engaging prostitutes, for when they do, they damage their own characters, they render themselves less solid and reliable as husbands and fathers, They weaken their marriages and their ability to enter into good marriages and authentically model for others, including their children, above all their sons, the virtue of chastity on which the integrity of marriages and of marriage as an institution in any given society depends. They set bad examples for others. We're all harmed. In short, they damage what I have referred to as the community's moral ecology. An ecology as vital to the community's well-being and as such as integral to the public interest as the physical ecology which is protected by environmental laws enacted to pursue the public interest in public health. Now, the question arises as to the scope of the police power to protect public morals. Much of what I've said about the harm of prostitution applies equally to fornication and adultery and many other things. And to be sure, public morals legislation has traditionally forbidden these vices just as it has forbidden prostitution. However, some people argue that while the legal prohibition of prostitution is legitimately within the scope of the police powers, the prohibition of fornication and adultery are not. The latter vices, however wicked and destructive of important public interests, are, they say, truly private, at least insofar as they are engaged in by consenting adults. Apparently, the view is that the commercial aspects, it's the commercial aspects of prostitution that makes the immoral acts of consenting adults in that case an issue of public as opposed to merely private concern. Now, it's of course true that prostitutes and their pimps are inviting and doing business with the public in a way that ordinary fornicators and adulterers are not. And I can certainly see how this distinction could be relevant to the prudential reasoning of legislators considering enactment or repeal of legal prohibitions of non-commercial sexual vice. What I cannot see, however, is the ground for claiming that a strict principle of justice, as opposed to a prudential concern, that a strict principle of justice excludes the criminal prohibitions of non-commercial sexual vice. The reasons for prohibition, namely the protection of a community's moral ecology against the corrosive effects on marriage and family life of sexual vices, may be defeated by competing prudential considerations. You have lots of reasons for not making fornication or adultery illegal. There are even reasons that are perfectly intelligible, you might not agree with them, for not making prostitution illegal, even if you concede that it's immoral. It might lead to a lot of police corruption, doesn't wipe it out anyway, drives it underground, causes street crime because people will of course, have to hide the prostitutes' conduct, and a lot of crime will grow up around that and so forth. So yes, there are prudential considerations, but to say that we ought not to make something illegal for prudential considerations is to say something very differently, something very different from what is typically said, which is we shouldn't make that conduct illegal because it's unjust to make it illegal. We shouldn't make that conduct illegal because people have a right to do it because it's nobody else's business, it's a private matter, and so forth. Now, needless to say, a great many people believe the contrary of what I'm here arguing, that there is my argument being that there's a genuine public interest in moral ecology which justifies public legal action to prohibit these vices, even though there may be competing prudential reasons not to. Some doubt that there is anything morally wrong with any form of sex act between consenting adults. My colleague Peter Singer at Princeton has famously argued for exactly this position, and it's not only adult humans that he has in mind. Where there is no coercion or perhaps dishonesty involved, they find nothing morally objectionable against prostitution, much less adultery or fornication. If such acts tend to undermine the institutions of marriage and the family, as these institutions are traditionally understood, then so much the worse for these institutions. These institutions are, they argue, in any event, in need of transformation. We need a new, uninhibited, more enlightened, more inclusive morality. If you think that, then there's not going to be any argument about the enforcement of public morals. There's not going to be any argument about laws upholding public morality because you don't believe that there is such a thing as public morality implicated in the area of sexuality in any event. If they are correct, then traditional public morals legislation, at least insofar as it pertains to sexual vice, is misguided at its root. And the reasons for not enforcing by law traditional concepts of sexual morality is that these concepts are themselves unsound. Of course, I think people who suppose that prostitution and adultery and so forth are morally innocent are profoundly mistaken, and I've set forth my reasons for thinking that at great length in various publications, so I won't repeat them here. The more interesting moral criticism of the criminal prohibition of vices, the one that I think should detain us and concern us today, the more interesting moral criticism will grant, for the sake of argument at least, that these are in fact vices, but then argue that there ought not to be any state prohibition of them, any legal regulation or at least restriction of them, because it's unjust for the law to enter that domain, or it's a violation of people's rights to privacy or to moral autonomy or to independence or what have you. Why is it wrong to criminalize these acts? Well, because it's asserted people have a moral right to do moral wrong. Perhaps that's because areas like this, like the sexual area, are inherently private in a more profound sense than the one I was indicating earlier. But I think the trouble with this argument, with this attempt to kind of mark off a whole field of human moral endeavor as immune from state regulation, as not bearing on the public interest, the trouble is that these vices, when widely practiced, tolerated, and inevitably widely accepted, has very big and very public consequences. Consequences that provide a perfectly intelligible reason for legal prescription, or short of that, non-coercive public efforts to discourage it. Just look at the impact of allegedly private behavior on the institution of marriage in our own culture and the culture of other developed capitalist nations. Now, to his credit, Professor Ronald Dworkin, the celebrated Oxford legal philosopher, candidly acknowledges that apparently private vices, including vices such as pornography, to which he believes people have nonetheless a moral right, can and do damage the public interest. So Dworkin and I disagree about whether there's a right to pornography, but he agrees with me that pornography, in any culture in which it flourishes, does grave harm to that culture, public harm. So Dworkin does not propose to derive rights to these vices, rights to pornography or any other vice, from a general right to liberty or autonomy. He doesn't believe in any such right. Government restricts liberty and autonomy all the time without violating anybody's rights. But for Dworkin, it's a basic right to equality, a right of individuals to be treated by the government with equal concern and respect, that grounds a right of moral independence, that provides the principled moral reason for government to refrain from criminalizing pornography. Or a follower of Dworkin might, by the same logic, add prostitution, adultery, fornication, what have you, despite its harm to the public interest. Dworkin maintains that government violates the basic right to equal concern and respect when it restricts liberty on the ground that one citizen's conception of what makes for or detracts from a morally valuable, worthy way of life is superior to another citizen's conception. For example, in forbidding pornography, the government limits Larry Flint's liberty, unjustly by hypothesis, on the ground that Billy Graham's view of whether pornography is wicked or harmless is the correct one. Now, of course, Dworkin does not claim that the government's error is supposing that there is a right answer to the moral question of pornography, or even that it is Graham rather than Flint who has the right answer. Indeed, Dworkin, who was one of my professors at Oxford, candidly and rightly concedes that pornography, where it is permitted to flourish, makes the community worse off in very concrete moral respects. Let me quote him. Pornography sharply limits the ability of individuals consciously and reflectively to influence the conditions of their own and their children's development. It limits their ability to bring about the cultural structure that they think best, a structure in which sexual experience in general has dignity and beauty, without which their own and their family's experience are likely to have these qualities in less degree, unquote. As I say, Dworkin is right to concede what he concedes about the way in which pornography, and we might add other forms of sexual vice, damages the community's moral ecology and thus the public interest. I couldn't have summarized it better myself. The trouble is, for Dworkin, that having made these concessions, his argument from the principle of equality falls apart. The basic problem is that legislators and other officials who act on the proposition that pornography is damaging the community in exactly the way Dworkin says it does, are not judging between Larry Flynt and Billy Graham, or even the moral convictions of Larry Flynt and Billy Graham in as much as they are Flint's or Graham's. They are acting, assuming as Dworkin does that they are responsible, conscientious officials, on their own considered best judgment as to whether and how pornography is bad. They are not banning pornography because Flynt is for it and or Graham is against it, nor does Dworkin imagine that that is why they are banning it. As he is perfectly aware, the fact that the judgment that pornography is morally bad and destructive of the common good is Billy Graham's, or Dworkin's, or mine, is of no particular relevance to the officials' deliberations. They might have high respect for Billy Graham. But it's not their respect for Billy Graham that grounds the moral judgment. They agree with him, and with me, and with Dworkin himself, that pornography is not only immoral, but immoral precisely in ways that damage the public interest in a cultural structure in which sexuality, as Dworkin himself says, has dignity and beauty, and without which their own experience and that of their children will have those values in lesser degree. Conscientious legislators, that is to say, are interested in reasons and arguments, not proper names, not individuals, whether Billy Graham or Larry Flynt or Robbie George or Ronald Dworkin. In judging the anti-pornography view to be sound and the pro-pornography view to be unsound, they are, of course, treating positions as other than equal, and inasmuch as these positions are held by people, one might say at some small risk of misleading that they are treating different people's positions unequally. But insofar as it is the positions as such being judged, they are in no way treating people, including the people holding the positions, unequally. It's not that Larry Flynt's right to the equal protection of the laws is being undermined when the legislature reaches the judgment that pornography is bad, a judgment that also happens to be held by Billy Graham. So although I agree with Dworkin that government has an obligation in justice to treat those under its authority with equal concern and respect, I find no violation of this principle in laws against pornography or any of these other vices. Now let me shift to the thought, and I'll close with this, of another distinguished Oxford legal philosopher, and as it happens, another one of my own teachers, Professor John Finnis, who I believe has lectured here. Now, Finnis, in his recent work, has proposed a principled moral limit to the authority of the state to enforce morality. Finnis's argument is far less sweeping in its scope than Dworkin's, and he entirely eschews what political philosophers, I'm sorry for the jargon, call the anti-perfectionism that Dworkin's thought shares with other orthodox liberal approaches to the question. Finnis does not appeal to rights of privacy or autonomy or liberty or moral independence as grounds for limitation on governmental authority to criminalize immoral behavior. And only in the most highly attenuated and strictly limited sense can it be said, Finnis's view be said to license a moral right to do moral wrong. Nothing in Finnis's argument, unlike Dworkin's, implies or entails the expressive individualism and accompanying elements of relativism characteristic of liberal political theories. The premise of Finnis's argument is that the common good of the political community is fundamentally an instrumental rather than an intrinsic, constitutive, and as such basic human good. Now, this is not to suggest that the political common good is unimportant or dispensable. On the contrary, Finnis recognizes that care of the political common good is profoundly important to the well-being of human persons and the associations they form, including associations such as the family and the church, whose common good is itself intrinsic and not merely instrumental. So they're unlike the state in that way. Moreover, the political common good is, I'm quoting Finnis, quoting Aristotle, great and godlike, in its profoundly ambitious range, which is, in Finnis's words, quote, to secure the whole ensemble of conditions to favor, facilitate, and foster the realization by each individual of his or her own personal development, and unquote, but Finnis makes clear that that personal development includes, because we are social beings, includes our flourishing as members of communities. So it's not a radical, expressive, individualist theory. Thus, political authority legitimately extends even to the regulation within limits of friendships, marriages, families, and religious associations, as well as the many organizations and associations which, like the state itself, have only an instrumental common good, say a business corporation. Business corporations don't exist to be business corporations. Business corporations exist to produce products or services, to make money for investors, to provide jobs for employees, and so forth. Still, inasmuch as the political common good is an instrumental good, Finnis argues, political authority is limited by the inherent limits of its general justifying aim, that is, to secure the conditions of well-being of individuals and their communities. So he quotes from the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, which in its Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, clearly affirms the instrumental quality of the political common good. Speaking of restrictions on religious liberty, the Declaration proposes that such restrictions are justified where required, quote, 1, for the effective promotion of the rights of all citizens in their peaceful coexistence, 2, a sufficient care for the authentic public peace and an ordered common life in true justice, and 3, upholding public morality. Now, as Finnis says, the Council's idea of public morality is precisely the preservation of a social environment conducive to virtue and inhospitable to at least the grosser forms of vice. This is not to say, however, that government may legitimately promote virtues and repress vices as such, that is, just for their own sakes, at least via coercive means. Finnis does not claim that the Council expressly rules this sort of legal moralism and paternalism out of bounds. His claim is merely that, quote, government is precisely not presented in the Declaration as dedicated to the coercive promotion of virtue and the repression of vice as such, unquote. I ask you to hold that quotation in mind. Government is precisely not presented in Dignitatis Humanae by the Church as dedicated to the coercive promotion of virtue and repression of vice as such. Now, I'm not sure whether the term precisely in Finnis's remark is doing any real work. Government is precisely not presented here as dedicated to the coercive promotion of virtue as such. What's that precisely doing there? Perhaps it is meant to suggest that the Council really did face the issue more or less squarely and come down the way Finnis thinks we should come down, once we've taken on board the implications for the scope of political authority of the fact that the common good of political society is instrumental rather than intrinsic. In any event, the key thing is that Finnis thinks that having taken on board this fact, we should see that law and the state exceed their just authority, thus violating principles of justice, when they go beyond the protection of the public moral environment and criminalize what Finnis calls, quote, even secret and truly consensual adult acts of vice, unquote. I disagree with my great teacher. I do so only with trepidation because he is truly a great teacher and a great man, and certainly knows a great deal more than I do. So I would happily judge myself to be wrong, but I can't find my way there. Perhaps I'm blinded by what a former professor at this institution, Joseph Boyle, once described, in jest I hope, as, quote, my incorrigibly authoritarian impulses. Or, as I like to think, perhaps I've caught John Finnis in his great generosity of spirit, straining to find a kernel of wisdom in the liberal account of freedom and public morality. However it may be, let me note that the difference between Finnis and me as a practical matter is quite small. First of all, even in the absence of a principled limit to the authority of the state to enforce true moral obligations along the lines of the one Finnis proposes, it seems to me that there are often compelling prudential reasons for law to tolerate vices. I've already mentioned that. lest efforts to eradicate those vices produce worse evils still, in terms of police corruption, to use a consideration that I mentioned before, the promotion of a damaging conformism in a population, hypocrisy, increases in crime. Some people will argue against drug prohibition, for example. Say that the real victims of drug prohibition are innocent old ladies who are mugged on the streets of New York by people who have to mug to get money to feed their drug habits because drug prohibition has raised the price of drugs so high. So I don't buy that argument, but it's not a totally implausible argument, and it's the kind of prudential argument that I think is legitimately taken into consideration and may be conclusive in any particular case by conscientious legislators. Now, to say that on the one hand, there's not a principled limit in justice to the legal prohibition of vices, but on the other hand, there may be very good prudential reasons not to exercise that power, is to do no more than to agree with St. Thomas Aquinas, who said in Summa Theologia 1-2, question 96a1, if I can quote chapter and verse, that law does not exist to repress all the vices, but only those which do social harm, and mostly those that do harm to others. Second, Finnis's position is hardly a liberal, much less strictly libertarian one. This is the second respect in which his position and my position are actually not that far apart. It's a disagreement in principle with a very, very small payoff. It's not a liberal, much less a libertarian one. Unlike, say, Dworkin and other mainstream liberal political theorists, Finnis goes so far as to say that the political community's rationale requires that its public managing structure, the state, should deliberately and publicly identify, encourage, facilitate, and support the truly worthwhile, including moral virtue, should deliberately and publicly identify and discourage and hinder the harmful and evil, and should, by its criminal prohibitions and sanctions, as well as its other laws and policies, assist people with parental responsibilities to educate children and young people in virtue and to discourage their vices. I want to say amen, brother, to that. Moreover, virtually the entire range of traditional morals legislation can and would be justified on grounds that fit well within Finnis's conception of the scope of the police powers to uphold public morals. Laws against intrinsic evils such as prostitution, pornography, drug abuse, and the like, as well as those against things that may not be wrong in themselves but require restriction or limitation because they can present moral dangers, moral hazards, such as gambling, the abuse of alcohol, and so forth, are justified in part by a concern to protect the public environment in ways that Finnis's approach to the question does not exclude. Now, on the subject of moral paternalism on which we disagree, and that's that point of principle which I think has only a limited payoff in practice, I suspect even there the difference between Finnis's position and mine is narrow. He would exclude in principle, and I would not, laws against private, non-commercial fornication, adultery, sodomy, and so forth. Now, again, I think there may be very good prudential considerations in any social circumstance for not making those things illegal, but I don't think that there's any right to them or that there's a consideration of justice which can lead us to conclude that we ought not to make them illegal, even apart from any deliberation about considerations of prudence. But where he would permit regulation, as in prohibiting prostitution, shutting down bathhouses, criminalizing the sale of illicit drugs, and so forth, and all of those he would permit. So this is not a kind of conventional Dworkinian liberal position at all. He would have my position on the substantive law on those things. I suspect he would see any good paternalistic side effects of such state action as welcome. In other words, if I'm right, Professor Finnis would not see paternalism as a valid justification for criminalization of a vice, as I think it could be, but where criminalization is justified for other reasons, he would welcome good paternalistic consequences, if there are any, and would believe that the state is acting within its rightful authority in structuring its laws and activities to produce such consequences where possible. What I have in mind here is analogous to the way in which some non-retributive goals of punishment, criminal punishment, such as deterrence or rehabilitation, are welcome and may rightly be sought, though by themselves they do not justify punishment, nor are they its central purpose. We can't punish somebody, we can't justify punishment by a desire for rehabilitation just by itself. If the guy doesn't commit a crime, we're not allowed to rehabilitate him. Why then do I resist Finnis's argument on that basic point? 2 reasons. First, it does not follow, or it seems to me, from the instrumental nature of the political common good that moral paternalism, where it can be effective, is beyond the scope of that very good. So I agree with Finnis and with the Second Vatican Council and with his interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, which I think is exactly right, that the common good of political society, unlike the common good of marriage and the family or the common good of the church, is an instrumental and not an intrinsic good. We're on the same wavelength there. He thinks it follows from that. I do not, that the state is restricted from any paternalistic motivations in respect of public morality. Second, I think that the concept of, quote, truly secret vices, unquote, is, when it comes to laws such as those we're talking about this evening, a very slippery and unsatisfactory one. So-called secret vices have a way of not staying secret. There may be good prudential reasons not to attack them with the full force of the law, and even where the law is employed, authorities should be careful not to employ excessive zeal in enforcing it. But that is not to say that as a matter of principle, the law may not forbid them. Thank you very much.
Dr. George, I think, is willing to accept questions, maybe for 10, 15 minutes. We'll take a few questions if people want to. There are microphones in both aisles, so you can line up on those microphones if you want to ask him very explicit applications of these principles in which he has honed in on one of the most difficult questions, I think, that we're facing in our culture.
Well, thank you, Sister, but where I'm bound to fail is on the specific applications. You know how philosophers are. I mean, yes, you, sir.
Well, maybe it's one of those that
okay.
caused me some challenge.
Okay.
I'm always finding myself in minorities, and one of those is that I'm less concerned watching a picture of a woman breastfeeding her child than I am a movie where people's bodies are being shredded and their heads chopped off. And in discussing pornography, where I can see problems with it, it's classically very difficult to define, and in your discussion of it, you overlooked that issue, and you might dismiss it as a prudential argument, but I think the definition of pornography is a really big one of those. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I can sort of work around that. I mean, there's not a set answer to it. I thought I made the point, if not, I should have made the point, that I wasn't using pornography as an example because I thought it was I did say this, didn't I, that it was the worst thing, the worst vice, or it was the only vice, or there weren't things that were worse, or that the failures of ethics by heads of big corporations aren't more damaging, and so forth and so on. So I was just using it as an example. On your question of violence, you don't really want to compare, you don't really want the comparison to be breastfeeding, right? I mean, watching a woman breastfeed is not, I mean, I don't watch a lot of pornographic movies, but it's not, from what people tell me, that's not one of the things that goes on. But oh yeah, well, okay, but I'm against that, right? I mean, sure, that's right. I mean, but it's not an unusual problem in the law for definitions to be fuzzy and difficult. I mean, throughout the law, definitions are fuzzy and difficult, but where there are important social goods at stake, the law has got to go in and it's got to make a clear legal definition. It needs a bright line, even where the line has to be to some extent arbitrary. So how should the law handle that? My own view is that the law should handle that by having a default theory or a theory of error. And the theory of error should be in the direction of permission. Because we do value liberty and we realize that people can be overzealous by doing ridiculous things like banning representations of breastfeeding, thinking that they're combating pornography, you should err on the side of liberty. So I have no problem about legislatures or courts letting stuff in that shouldn't be in because you are going to err that way. But a theory of error is one thing that expands the permission and permits things to be unregulated that, strictly speaking, as a matter of justice, could be regulated. That's one thing. It's another thing to say, we're going to throw up our hands and not forbid any pornography because we can't draw that line. I mean, the line drawing will involve the judgments of people, ordinarily 12 jurors, subject to judicial review according to constitutional standards. We have a constitutional standard which, if it were actually honored by the courts, strikes me, and I want to say again, I'm not good at practical applications, but it does strike me as a perfectly reasonable one. That is, material that appeals to the prurient interest in sex, which is not redeemed by any scientific, social, or artistic value. That's going to allow plenty of stuff in that's pretty explicit, but it's also going to rule some stuff out which just on no responsible account could be said to have any redeeming value. It is merely corrupting. Now, what about violence? Well, it's not a question of either or. It's not to say, well, gee, if we ban pornography, that means we're not going to be able to do anything about violence. There's some violence that's pornographic. It doesn't involve sex, but it does involve the glorification of violence. And there are certain forms of regulation that I think are perfectly reasonable. Like, for example, making sure that it's not watched by adolescents, having restrictions, kids 17 not admitted, putting parents in a position where they can actually get some assistance in trying to keep that kind of material away from boys. And even laying aside government's role, as I did in the first half of the paper. Shouldn't business corporations who make computer games, shouldn't Hollywood, shouldn't people who are involved in the television industry and in entertainment exercise their responsibility when it comes to violence to avoid the corrupting effects of a glorification of violence? I mean, I think they should. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bet. You bet. And, you know, and the FCC has actually acted on it in our lifetimes.
So where do we draw the line as to when, what government can deem acceptable?
Well, let me make 2 points about that. First, don't forget the first half of my paper, which is really the main point I want to leave you with. We usually think of this, and the question session is already proving that we're doing it again, as, gee, what should the government do? The whole first half of the paper is about what should individual citizens do? What should corporate leaders do? Well, look, even if there were no government, I want to hold those Budweiser guys responsible. Or was it Budweiser? I shouldn't, whichever beer company it was. You know, I really want to hold them responsible for that. Just as we held the tobacco companies responsible for the harm that they did in the public health domain. And that doesn't mean necessarily that the law is going to come in, but citizens should make it clear that they're going to hold this against the companies who do these kinds of things. Then there's the question of the law. Now we have a way of handling that in our society. Because of some peculiarities of our constitutional law, we do treat this as a federal issue because it has to do with communications and the airwaves. Well, I think it turned out that that worked in the Janet Jackson case pretty well. The law stepped in. It didn't step in too far. It didn't chill TV to the point where women have to wear chadors on TV. We certainly are a long way from that. But at the same time, it did say, look, guys, if you do this kind of thing, you're going to pay a fine. And it happened, and I think the message was conveyed. So we've got a pretty good system for drawing the line. Does it involve human judgment? Absolutely. Is there a mechanical or computer way to do this? Absolutely not. But the way we've got to do it works pretty well. Yeah, I should go to this side. Yes, ma'am.
I would argue that you were talking about public health, safety, and morals, that public morals are actually the overarching theme, because morals, I think, deals with health and safety. And I think that's very misconstrued in our society, where we don't see morals as what informs health, what informs safety. So my question then would be, families seem to me to be very uneducated on their role in society and unsupported. So what kind of even practical laws in your own experience working with the various things you've done, how is the family supported, legally by, having education or something like that?
Okay, now you're bringing me into the laws again,
Right,
which is fine. That was the second half of my talk. Just don't lose the first half, okay? Now, let me say the respect in which I think you're right and make an excellent point, and one that I hadn't made on your first point, but also the sense in which I don't want you to take that too far. The first point that you made, which I think is excellent, is this. A consideration to protect public health is not itself abstracted from moral judgment. The very judgment that the public health is something we ought to be concerned about, that government has a responsibility to deal with, is itself a moral judgment. I assume that's what you meant, right? And you're absolutely right about that. But here's why I don't want you to not take it too far, and not to realize that there's also a very important sense in which public health, safety, and morals stand as an independent of each other as a kind of triad. And that's this. When the government stops the smoke or now you got me doing the government. When the government concerns itself with legislating to prevent those smokestacks from spewing out the carcinogens, it's the interest it's pursuing there, that it's protecting there, is not the interest in good character. It's the interest in not having lung cancer or not having brain tumors. It's precisely a public health interest as distinct from a public morality interest, which is exactly what's implicated in the pornography case. In the pornography case, when the government comes in, it's worried about the harm that pornography does to the character of its citizens and the impact of bad character in this particular domain of sexual morality on the institutions that are so vital to the functioning and health of society, especially marriage and the family. So, yep, it's an overarching moral concern, but there's also a sense in which these are distinct, okay? Now, you were asking for concrete examples of how law supports the family. Okay, now those are prudential judgments, okay? There's no way as a moral philosopher trying to lay down abstract principles I can tell you what that ought to be. So I'm just going to now give you my judgments as a citizen about these things, and they're very, very dependent on context. The laws might have to be very different in this respect in one part of the country than they would be in another part of the country. Laws that might make sense today, given our environment and problems and challenges, might be different from what would have made sense 50 years ago or 100 years ago. On the marriage front, I think the problem is dealt with too late when it's dealt with on the back end. It's got to be dealt with on the front end. Now, that's not to say we should give up on trying to preserve marriages that are in trouble already. But I think there are limits to what anybody can do, and certainly very severe limits to what the law can do there. Now, that's not an endorsement of no-fault divorce, which we now know from plenty of social science research has been a disaster because it has, in fact, altered people's understandings of what they're getting into on the front end when they make the commitment to marriage. But what I'm saying is, once the marriage is already in trouble, it's really hard, and certainly hard for the law, to do anything much to help. I think here, churches and other so-called accountability communities are the best defense we have against marital breakup. The question is, can you do something on the front end with the laws? Some states are making it a little more difficult to be married, and they're requiring that you actually have some premarital counseling. Now, this is something that the Catholic Church has traditionally done, and a lot of churches have traditionally done. Whether or not it's a good idea for the state to mandate it, I'm not sure. Some people argue that it actually creates an additional deterrent just when we don't need a deterrent to marriage. People are perfectly happy to live together without marriage. The tougher you make it, the more difficult it's going to be. But there are other people, responsible social scientists and social critics who say, no, actually it doesn't work that way. Actually, people are more inclined to take marriage seriously when the law is making it something not that easy to enter into. That actually elevating it in this way with, for example, to use another example, so-called covenant marriages, where people are given the option of a certain type of marriage with different norms and different dissolution procedures, if it comes to that, in return for making certain commitments, and which involve also premarital counseling. I think the Louisiana covenant marriage statute requires premarital counseling. So I think with respect to this particular most important social problem at all of the family dissolution, I think it's got to be on the front end. Whatever the law is going to do, I think it's got to be more on the front end than it is on the back end. But the law should never forget, lawmakers should never forget that whatever laws they shape with respect to marriage and everything surrounding it will have an impact on people's understandings of what it is they're getting into when they marry. That's what legislators failed to think very hard about when we fell headlong in a rush into the regime of no-fault divorce. I think a lot of legislators thought, well, look, we got a lot of people in unhappy marriages. Courts are spending time and resources trying to sort through fault issues, which are just a headache and just awful. Can't we make life easier for judges, life easier for breaking up husbands and wives who are divorcing, life easier for everybody and cheaper if we just go with the no-fault rule? What they didn't anticipate is that the alteration in the rules of family dissolution would have an impact on what commitments people were preparing to make from the beginning, so that it would actually have an impact on the divorce rate. They were thinking the divorce rate stays the same, it's just, all that changes is whether it's easier and less expensive to have divorces. But that turns out, we now know from 25 years of social science, we now know it's not what happened. The rate didn't stay the same. The law affects the rate. Yeah.
Dr. George, when you started off, you were talking a little bit about how the states were traditionally had more judicial powers of regulation of like police powers, we would say, and it's kind of over the 20th century gone to the federal government. So I have two questions. One, is that problematic for your understanding of public morality, for the way that you have been trying to tell us tonight? And also, do you see anything how it might be going back to the states, or where do you see it going from here as far as the policing powers of the government, the federal government or the state government?
Yeah. It's a very good question. The major change was with the New Deal. Through the Coolidge administration and into the Hoover administration, the reality is that presidents would sometimes do even unpopular things, veto legislation on constitutional grounds, precisely because of respect for the delegated powers theory. I mean, Coolidge actually did that. The New Deal really changed. The Depression changed all the circumstances, and then the New Deal changed things because Roosevelt, and with the country behind him, felt that things needed to be done on the national level that had traditionally been done, if at all, by the states, and that we simply couldn't afford to go through the procedures of amending the Constitution, which might not even work in any particular case, since the Constitution's own procedures for its amendment are very difficult. The standard is very high. It's not worth trying to amend the Constitution to accomplish it. So after some initial resistance, in which the court struck down early New Deal programs, the court acquiesced in 1937. The case was called West Coast Hotel against Parrish, and essentially got out of the business of enforcing limitations on the federal invocation of the commerce power as the ground for legislation, the power to regulate interstate commerce. So the next thing you know, Congress is, without any judicial intervention, regulating the production and sale of milk that's all going on within one county of Michigan. No state borders anywhere near, but it's an internal county of Michigan, 3 counties away from any border. And nevertheless, that's judged to be perfectly legitimate for Congress to do under the commerce power. Well, once that has happened, you don't really have a government of delegated and enumerated powers anymore. The federal government has become a government of general jurisdiction. And where the federal government has moved in, state power has, of course, contracted. So the balance of power between the federal government and the state governments has shifted very decisively in favor of the federal government. Now, I'm not actually condemning that all the way. I think that there are problems with that. I'm sorry it's gone as far as it went. I wish that Congress would exercise more self-restraint for the sake of the delegated powers theory. But at the same time, I think that just economic and social reality required an increase in the power of the federal government. Now, since we have gone too far, in my opinion, you ask, should we go back and can we go back? Yes, I think we should go back to some extent. I'd much rather Congress police itself rather than relying on the courts to police it, but I wish Congress would do it. I wish Congress would sometimes refrain for the sake of the delegated powers theory, where it really doesn't have a strong federal interest. Will it do it? Can it do it? In the mid-1990s, it looked like the courts were going to intervene to force them to do it. It looked like there truly would be a new federalism. There was going to be a revival of the pre-1937 jurisprudence in which the court told the Congress, there are some places you can't go. If you've studied some constitutional law, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's this case of Lopez versus United States, in which the Supreme Court of the United States struck down the Gun-Free School Zones Act, the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act, on the ground that a federal prohibition of possession of a firearm within 300 yards of a school was unconstitutional as an exercise of power beyond the delegated powers delegated by the Constitution of the United States. But then, the revolution never came. What looked like it was going to be the opening salvo in a decisive or at least significant movement by the courts of the Congress back in the name of the delegated powers theory just died on the vine as far as I can tell. There were one or two cases where federal power was cut back and the Lopez decision was invoked as a precedent, but it was just one or two cases. Everyone thought Justice O'Connor would lead the charge because she was the most fervent Federalist of them all, and with a swing voter like that, and with Justices Scalia and O'Connor and Rehnquist and Thomas on the court, it really looked like it would go that direction. But the steam seems to have gone completely out of it. Now, why is that happening? My guess is it has above all to do with the fact that there is no public desire, there is no public appetite for significant restrictions on federal power. I mean, the Bush administration is really no different from the Clinton administration as far as exercising power at the federal level. Look at the No Child Left Behind Act. It's the federal government involving itself in education, which was always traditionally considered to be the state power par excellence, the one in which the federal government just had no role. So at the end of the day, I think what has shifted is not just the opinions of some judges, but it's the opinions of the American public. It's the American public's own understanding of the kind of government it wants. And it wants a strong federal government. It complains about it, it complains about all the spending, but in its votes, in the practical prosecution of citizenship, people in effect vote for a federal government of general jurisdiction. It's exactly the way the federal government behaves today. Okay? Yeah, sure.
Is it the rise in power of the government that has really brought the decline in morality, or is the decline in morality the lack of personal morality within society allows the government to become the beast that it is?
Well, now you've raised a question quite different from the fellow sitting in front of you. You've now raised the question about what is the relationship between the shifting of power to Washington, D.C. from local government, the relationship between that and moral decline. Now, that is a very complicated, you don't even want me to start on this, but it's a very complicated question. What can I say in short order about it? I can say this. If everything is done at the federal level, the one thing you are sure to lose is Louis Brandeis's conception of the states as 50 well, it wasn't 50 in his day, but in our day it would be 50 laboratories of experimentation to see what really works and what really doesn't. Here's a good example, and then I'll shut up. What is the impact of different sorts of welfare provision on behavior? Criminality, out-of-wedlock births. What is the impact of different types of welfare? Now, here's an area where actually the federal government has moved things back to the states. And I think, regardless of how one judges overall that type of welfare reform, I think there's going to be at least one good effect, which is you're going to see some experimentation on precisely that question. We know that federal welfare assistance has impact, or not, strike federal, that welfare assistance, however it's provided, whether no government at all is involved, and it's all handled privately by churches, as it was in Dickensian England, or whether it's the federal welfare entitlement of FDR, we know that the system affects behavior. Well, if we have, it won't be 50 different ones, but if we have 4 or 5 different, significantly different models out there in the states, looked at over 5 or 10 years, we're going to know some things about what types of welfare provision affect behavior for the worse and what types affect it for the better. I think that's a good thing. Okay, thanks.
Dr. George, at the University of St. Thomas, we strive to educate leaders of faith and character. And your insights and linkage of individual actions and individual morality, what we do in the public domain, not only addresses the essence of Catholic studies, but the essence of educating leaders. So thank you very much for launching us off on a great start of this series. As a small token of our thanks, we'd like to give you this memento to take back with you to Virginia, and we hope that you will come back and visit us again very soon. God bless you, sir, for what you've done.
Thank you, John. Thank you all. Thank you all very much.